In 2021, more than 14 million people entered Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the most visited national park in the United States. More than the Grand Canyon, more than Yellowstone, more than the two of them combined. Nearly all of them funneled through a single town on the way in. Gatlinburg, Tennessee counted, that same year, fewer than 4,000 permanent residents, fewer people than fill one home game in most American college towns. Fewer than the parking spaces the town would need on a July Saturday and does not have. Set the two numbers side by side, and the ratio comes out to roughly one resident for every 3,500 visitors who arrive each year to look at the mountains behind his house. That ratio did not exist in 1807, when the first settler families walked into this valley on foot because there was no road wide enough for a wagon. It did not exist in 1900. It barely existed in 1930. Something built it, deliberately, across more than a century of effort. And in a single week in the autumn of 2016, the valley came close to losing almost everything that effort had produced. This is the story of how a settlement, once known as White Oak Flats, became the busiest doorway to wilderness in the United States. Chapter 1. The Hollow at the Foot of the Mountains. The valley explains the town before the town explains itself. It sits at the base of the Great Smoky Mountains, a narrow trough cut by the Little Pigeon River, walled in on nearly every side by ridgelines that run for miles without a gap wide enough for a road. Cherokee hunting parties had moved through that trough for generations, following the river and the game trails cut along its banks, and the formal removal of their nation from these mountains was still 3 decades away when the first white families arrived. No mill turned in the hollow yet. A store was still decades off. The place did not even have a name. The only way in was on foot or on horseback. A journey that took days regardless of season, over ground steep enough that a loaded animal had to be led, not ridden, for long stretches of it. Knoxville lay one direction, the North Carolina settlements the other, and from the floor of the hollow neither one felt any closer than the other. There was no shortcut around any of it. Distance like that does something to a household. Families in the hollow made their own tools. Feet die because no peddler was climbing 3 mountain passes to sell a hammer. Cloth got woven at home too, since bolts of manufactured fabric arrived, when they arrived at all, strapped to a mule after a week on the trail. Liquor was distilled on the same principle, an art the hills would keep alive for a century after the rest of the country switched to the general store. A broken plow blade, a torn coat, a fever in the middle of winter, all of it had to be handled with whatever the household already had on hand, because help was days away in every direction. Nothing came predictably, so nothing was trusted to arrive on its own. Self-sufficiency was not a virtue up in that hollow. It was the entry fee. Martha Jane Husky Ogle paid it in 1807. She led her children and her late husband's kin over a route William Ogle had cut the year before and never walked again. He had scouted the valley, marked out land for a farm, and died on the journey back to fetch the family he meant to bring in behind him. Martha did not let the plan die with him. She gathered the household, retraced William's route, and settled the land he had chosen, becoming one of the valley's first documented white settler families in the process. The community that grew up around the Ogles took its name from what covered the hillsides above their cabins. White oak, dense and unbroken, cleared tree by tree to make room for corn. They called it White Oak Flats. Other families followed the same route in over the next few decades, drawn by the same land and willing to pay the same isolation for it, and the trickle slowly became a settlement. Small enough that everyone in it still knew everyone else, but permanent enough to need a name. For half a century, that was the whole of it. A name, a handful of families, and a river. Then in 1856, Radford C. Gatlin arrived. He was a merchant by trade, and by his own declaration, a Baptist preacher. an ordination nobody but Gatlin himself had ever granted. He opened the settlement's second general store, secured its first post office, and registered it under his own name so that for the first time, mail bound for White Oak Flats carried a name that was not the Valley's. It did not sit well for long. The specifics of the disputes have not survived in much detail, but the pattern has. Gatlin quarreled with one neighbor, then another, with a persistence that outlasted their patience, until the community did what a small settlement does with a man it can no longer stand. It pushed him out for good, but the post office kept his name on it, and mail, unlike neighbors, does not hold a grudge. In 1897, White Oak Flats would meet the man who actually built it. Chapter 2: The Millman and the Roman Guide. Andy Huff was that man. He arrived in the valley in 1897, a young mill operator with no particular claim to the place, beyond the fact that he had come to cut its timber before anyone else did. What he found waiting for him barely qualified as a town. It had no bank, no newspaper either. What passed for commerce was a single general store, the kind of outpost where credit ran on a handshake and cash changed hands only when it had to. Huff did not stay idle in that vacuum. He put up one sawmill, then another, then a working string of them along the river, cutting the same white oak that had given the settlement its old name and turning it, for the first time, into lumber that could finally leave the valley by the wagon load. His crews outgrew his house before his business outgrew the valley. For a stretch of years, he simply bunked his mill hands under his own roof, until there were too many men and not enough roof. In 1912, the Pi Beta Phi women's fraternity founded a settlement school in the valley, built on the premise that literacy and craft could travel together into places the rest of the country had written off as unreachable. Alongside reading and arithmetic, the school taught weaving and pottery in the old mountain patterns, skills that isolated families already possessed and had never had a way to sell. It was, in its own quiet fashion, the valley's second industry, handwork turned into income for households that had none. The school opened the aerocraft shop to sell what its students made, and the shop found customers well outside the valley. Visitors first, then mail-order buyers scattered across the country who had never seen the mountains at all. By 1965, the settlement school's teaching mission would fold entirely into what became the Aeromont School of Arts and Crafts, a single institution absorbing 50 years of quiet work into one name. Huff, meanwhile, had stopped thinking only in board feet. In 1916, he opened the Mountain View Hotel below his own house, 100 rooms built for an audience the valley had never had reason to serve before. Strangers, unconnected to any mill or any farm, who had come only to look at the scenery. 100 rooms was not a modest figure for a settlement that, 20 years earlier, had not had a single building meant for outsiders at all. It became almost overnight the valley's first real point of contact with the outside world, the place where an outsider found a bed, a meal, and someone who could point him toward the high peaks. The hotel would stand for the next 77 years. Huff had built his sawmills to cut the valley's timber. He built the hotel to sell its view, and in time the second business would outlive the first by decades. That hotel needed guides, and the valley had one waiting. Wiley Oakley was mountain-born, a hunter and storyteller who had spent no more than a few weeks of his life in a schoolroom, and he began leading curious out-of-towners into the high country in the 1920s, hired first through the Huff's front desk. He talked as he walked, spinning tales pitched somewhere between memory and invention, tall stories about the peaks and the creatures on them that grew a little taller with every telling. Visitors who had never met anyone quite like him carried the stories home with them, and the region came to know him as the Roman Man of the Mountains, a nickname that outlasted most of the tourists who coined it. He and his wife Rebecca eventually opened a shop of their own, selling crafts and souvenirs to the same visitors he had been guiding for years. One of the valley's first businesses built on tourism rather than timber or farming. A mill, a school, a hotel, a guide with a shop of his own. 4 separate ventures, each answering to nobody but its founder, quietly building the valley's first economy that had nothing to do with what grew in its soil. None of it required a road. Every visitor who found Wiley Oakley or checked into the Mountain View Hotel had still come in on foot, on horseback, or by whatever wagon track could survive a mountain winter. That would not hold much longer. Chapter 3: The Road, the Park, and the Price of Wilderness. In 1930, the Civilian Conservation Corps arrived with picks, dynamite, and federal payroll, and set out to do in 2 years what the valley's geography had refused for over a century. Camps went up along the route, filled with young men enrolled in one of the first New Deal work programs, paid $1 a day to blast a road through a mountain range. Surveyors had once refused to certify for wagon travel at any grade. Crews cut switchbacks up one face of the mountains and down the other, working toward a summit that would eventually carry the road to 5,046 feet, the highest paved crossing in the southern Appalachians. When Newfound Gap Road opened in 1932, it connected Gatlinburg to Cherokee, North Carolina, on the far side of the range, and did to distance what Andy Huff's sawmills had done to timber a generation earlier. It turned something that used to take days into something that could simply be delivered. A trip that had once meant walking for the better part of a week became a drive of a few hours. For the first time since Martha Ogle had led her family in on foot, a stranger did not have to earn his way into the valley. He could just arrive. That road made possible something a small circle of conservationists had been chasing for a decade: a national park in the Smokies, assembled not from federal land Washington already owned, but bought outright, acre by acre, from thousands of private owners. The fundraising campaign to pay for it stalled for years. States, private donors, and school children dropping in dimes, straining toward a total that kept slipping out of reach. It was still short when the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial Fund stepped in and donated $5 million to close the gap. Congress established Great Smoky Mountains National Park in 1934. 6 years later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood on a stone platform at Newfound Gap, on the ridge above Gatlinburg, a platform built directly on the Tennessee-North Carolina line so that half his audience that day stood in one state and half in the other, and dedicated the park in person to a crowd that had driven in on the same road the CCC had just finished cutting through the mountain. The isolation that had defined the valley for over a century was, officially, over. Assembling that land meant emptying it first. Nearly 6,000 people were removed from farms their families had worked for generations, more than 1,000 individual holdings taken through eminent domain at an average price of about $25 an acre. Assessors moved through the mountains valuing cabins, barns, family cemeteries, and apple orchards planted decades earlier, the way a company might appraise standing timber. Some left with a check and 30 days' notice on a house their grandparents had built. Others were granted lifetime leases instead, permitted to go on living and eventually die, on land the government now legally owned. A few refused to leave at all and were removed anyway. The law made no exception for the length of a family's memory. The wilderness that visitors would soon call untouched had been someone's cornfield the year before. 1,000 farms, $25 an acre, 6,000 people gone. Word of the new park spread slowly at first, then steadily, through the 1940s and into the 1950s, and Gatlinburg, sitting at its most convenient entrance on the Tennessee side, absorbed the traffic year after year, attendance climbing every season without a single year of decline. Unlike almost every other national park in the country, Great Smoky Mountains charged no entrance fee, a condition tied to the original road agreement, and it removed the one barrier that kept casual travelers away from every other park in the system: Visitors did not need a reason to stop. They needed a car and a Sunday afternoon. And by the late 1950s, a great many of them had both. Andy Huff's 100-room hotel, once the valley's only real stop for outsiders, could no longer absorb what was arriving on its own. Other men in Gatlinburg had already started doing the arithmetic on what all those cars were worth. Chapter 4. The Mountain and the Machine. The arithmetic came out in favor of the mountain first. In January 1962, a group of local investors opened Gatlinburg's first piece of infrastructure built for people who had no reason to stay the night. A private ski club on the slope above town, 2 runs cut through the hardwood, a lodge with a fire in it, and an outdoor ice rink for the weeks when the runs went bare. It was one of the only ski operations anywhere in the Southeast, a distinction that had less to do with snow than with nerve. The Smokies hold real winter for only a handful of weeks each year, and a ski slope built on that kind of weather is a wager dressed up as a business. For a valley that had spent a century and a half surviving on timber, corn, and whatever a mule could carry over the ridge, this was something genuinely new. Money bet on visitors who had nowhere else they needed to be. 11 years later, the mountain took a second wager, and this one arrived from considerably farther away than Knoxville or Pittsburgh. In August 1973, a Swiss-built aerial tramway began carrying passengers up the same slope the ski club had opened in 1962. 2 enclosed cabins running on a cable strung across the mountainside, climbing well over 1,000 feet of elevation in a matter of minutes. It was not a local contractor's project. It was imported engineering, shipped from a country that had been stringing cable into real mountains for the better part of a century, installed in a range most Americans still pictured full of log cabins and moonshine stills. The tramway alone represented the kind of capital a valley this size had never absorbed in a single transaction. Gatlinburg had gone, in barely a decade, from a town with 1 hotel to a town importing alpine engineering. The mountain had never seen money like that. The ski club did not last long enough to see any of it. It had opened in January 1962 with 2 slopes and a lodge, and the confidence of men certain that a few good winters would prove the wager sound. It went bankrupt within 13 years, sometime in 1975. The runs closed, the lodge shuttered, the ice rink drained and cracking. 13 years is not a long run for a piece of mountain infrastructure. It is a short one for a fortune to disappear into a hillside of white oak and rhododendron. There was no single storm, no one bad season on record, just winters that came too warm, too short, too unreliable, one after another, for 2 ski runs in a mountain range that had never really been built for the sport. The lifts stopped turning. Half a mile away, the tramway's cable kept running regardless, carrying tourists who had come for the view and never once asked about snow. What survived the collapse was the machine, not the club. A single developer bought both failed properties, the idle ski runs and the still-running tramway, and did what men with capital in this story always eventually did, merged them into one enterprise and hung his own name over what remained. In 1977, the combined operation reopened as Gatlinburg, and the mountain above the valley became for the first time a single business instead of 2 competing ones. The lifts that had gone dark in 1975 turned again. The tramway kept doing exactly what it had done since 1973, hauling paying passengers over the treetops for a view that owed nothing to the season and nothing, any longer, to the men who had first bet on snow. The name stuck. The snow never really did. By the late 1970s, the mountain above Gatlinburg carried a ski operation, a Swiss-built tramway, and a name that would outlast both of the businesses it had swallowed. But the mountain was not the only place in town reaching for altitude that decade. Down on the parkway itself, at street level, something else had already gone up. Tall, strange, and owing nothing to slopes or snow, and it had been standing for 4 years before the tramway ever left the ground. Now, Chapter 5. The Strip Fills In. That structure was the Gatlinburg Space Needle, and it had opened in 1969. 407 feet of open steel lattice, rising straight up from the middle of the parkway, a gift shop at its base, and nothing but a view at its top. The name borrowed directly from the tower Seattle had raised for its 1962 World's Fair, though this one owed nothing to a fair, an exposition, or any civic ambition beyond pulling foot traffic off the sidewalk. It served no timber operation, carried no tourists toward a trailhead, and answered no real question about the mountains themselves. It existed for one purpose, so a family standing on the sidewalk with an afternoon to spend could look up, buy a ticket, and ride an elevator toward something. The tramway above town was by then hauling visitors well over 1,000 feet into real elevation on the strength of real rock. The Space Needle offered no rock at all, only height, built and sold by the foot, 407 of them, the flattest possible expression of the arithmetic the town had already learned to trust. Nobody climbed it to see anything the mountains did not already show for free. They climbed it anyway. What followed the needle was not one attraction, but hundreds, arriving faster than any single business ever mattered on its own. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the parkway filled in block by block, storefront by storefront, until the 2-lane road Andy Huff would barely have recognized carried more retail than the whole town had carried residents a generation earlier. Taffy shops went in first, pulling candy in the front window for anyone who cared to stop and watch. Wax museums followed, populated with figures rendered in every degree of likeness. Miniature golf courses filled in behind those. Fairways laid out around fiberglass peaks, scaled down from the real mountains a few hundred yards away. Pancake houses took whatever space still remained, open by 6 most mornings and full past noon most Saturdays between April and October. By the middle of the 1980s, the attraction stood 3 and 4 to a block, close enough that a family could walk from one to the next without ever returning to the car. The arithmetic never changed. Put something in front of people who are already there, and they will pay for it. Tennessee made one part of that arithmetic almost absurdly simple. The state required no waiting period and no blood test for a marriage license. A couple could apply in the morning and stand at an altar by early afternoon, with no doctor's visit required, no lab result to wait on, and nothing resembling a cooling-off period between the decision and the ceremony. Gatlinburg leaned into that fact completely, building a second economy around ministers, chapels, and photographers who could turn a license into a wedding inside the hour. Some chapels operated out of strip motels, a minister on call, and a photographer waiting in the parking lot. Others stood as freestanding storefronts wedged between a taffy shop and a mini golf course, indistinguishable from their neighbors, except for the flowers in the window. By the 1990s, the town was hosting roughly 20,000 weddings a year, a figure many times larger than the town's own permanent population. It was not a wedding destination in the way Niagara Falls had built its reputation over the better part of a century. On postcards and honeymoon mythology, it was a wedding destination because the paperwork was fast and the mountains made a convincing backdrop for a photograph. That was the whole of the appeal, and it was enough. By the middle of the 1990s, the parkway had filled in from one end to the other, block after block, with almost nowhere left to build. Downtown alone still had room, a stretch of open ground near the river that the taffy shops and wax museums had passed over for 2 decades. What went up there next needed no mountain view and no marriage license. It didn't need a ticket to an elevator either. It needed water, a great deal of water. And by the end of that decade, downtown Gatlinburg had it. Chapter 6. The Aquarium and the Peak. It arrived that December, downtown, built around 1.4 million gallons of imported seawater. Ripley's Aquarium of the Smokies opened in December 1999, in a valley landlocked for as long as anyone had kept records of it, a fact nobody in marketing seemed troubled by. Visitors descended into a glass tunnel laid through the floor of the main tank and walked beneath sharks and stingrays, looking up at exactly the kind of predator the Little Pigeon River had never produced. Downtown had filled in with taffy shops and wax museums for 2 decades by then. This was the first major attraction built around depth instead of height, water instead of altitude. It was not a wager the way the ski club or the tramway had been, staked on snow or elevation or a single good season. It was simply a tank, filled once, that people kept paying to see. Within 25 years, it had drawn well over 15 million visitors through its doors, making it one of the most visited paid attractions anywhere in the state of Tennessee. The valley that had once made its own tools because no peddler could climb 3 mountain passes to sell 1 now imported sharks. By the middle of the 2000s and 10s, the numbers below the aquarium's tank matched the scale of everything built up around it over the previous half-century. More than 12 million people were passing into the national park in a single recent year, more than any other park in the country received. More than $2 billion were passing into Sevier County's economy that same year, generated almost entirely by the town sitting at the park's front door. More than 20,000 weddings were passing into its chapels annually, same as they had for years already. 12 million visitors a year works out to roughly 32,000 people a day, spread across a town of fewer than 4,000. None of those figures existed on paper as recently as 1930. When the road through the mountains did not exist either. To see what the totals actually looked like from the sidewalk, on an ordinary Saturday night, it helps to stand on the parkway itself. Picture the parkway on a Saturday evening in October of 2015, leaf season. The sidewalk's too full to walk through without waiting your turn. The Space Needle is lit top to bottom, 407 feet of steel strung with white bulbs against a sky already dark by 7. Ripley's Aquarium glows blue along its glass front below, and up on the mountain. The lights of the Gatlinburg tram slide along the cable line, a thin string of motion against the dark ridge. Traffic on the 2-lane road has stopped moving altogether, brake lights stacked for blocks. Funnel cake sugar hangs in the air outside one doorway, taffy pulled and folded in a shop front window a few doors down. A valley that had been unbroken wilderness barely a century earlier now held, on one Saturday night, more visitors passing through than had ever lived in the town at all. The following October, the leaves turned anyway, the way they always had, red and gold working down the ridgeline from the highest elevations toward the valley floor. But almost no rain had come with them. By the fall of 2016, the entire region sat inside an exceptional drought, among the driest conditions recorded in more than a century of weatherkeeping in the southern Appalachians, a record that in some counties stretched back into the 1880s. The creeks feeding the Little Pigeon ran low and slow, and the hardwood forest above Gatlinburg, the same forest that had once kept the valley cut off from the rest of the country, stood dry as kindling on every slope above the tourists still filling the parkway below. Reservations for the season held near capacity regardless. Leaf season did not know about drought indices, and neither did the people driving in for it. On November 23rd, a small fire was reported near the chimney tops, 2 peaks inside the national park, a few miles from where the tram lights climbed the ridge each night. It was initially treated as containable. Chapter 7. The Fire. For 5 days, that assessment held. On the slopes above the valley, the fire crept rather than spread, working through drought-cured leaf litter and standing dead wood at a pace slow enough that park crews kept describing it, day after day, as contained within manageable lines. Fire on that kind of ground without wind behind it can smolder for a week and threaten nothing beyond its own perimeter. Rain, which might have ended the matter outright, did not come. Reservations across Gatlinburg held near capacity through the week regardless, leaf season running its ordinary course a few miles from a fire that most of the town was not yet tracking closely. On November the 28th, forecasters flagged the one condition the fire had been missing since the 23rd: wind, arriving that evening ahead of a cold front. It did not arrive gently. Sustained winds of 40 to 50 miles an hour moved through the region that night, gusting past 85 in exposed terrain. Wind at that speed does not simply push a fire forward, it dismantles it, tearing burning bark and pine needles loose from trees that are already alight and carrying them, still lit, over ridgelines and creek beds the fire itself had never crossed. Embers lifted off the chimney tops that evening came down miles away, on roofs and in dry gutters, and against cedar siding on streets that had never been inside any evacuation line. The fire did not walk into Gatlinburg. It arrived by air, in pieces, ahead of any front a crew on the ground could have held. By nightfall it was burning inside the town limits, in a dozen separate places at once. Each one had started the same way: a single ember, landing somewhere with no reason to expect it. Roughly 14,000 residents and visitors left the valley that night, many with less warning than the distance they had to cover. Evacuation orders reached some neighborhoods only after the fire prompting them was already visible from the porch. Traffic backed up on roads built for a town of under 4,000, cars moving past flame on both sides in places, drivers making decisions under a few minutes of notice that would be examined in county hearing rooms for years afterward. 14 people did not survive the night. By the time the wind eased and crews regained some measure of control, more than 2,400 structures across the county had been destroyed or damaged. Some of it was homes, upward of 2,100 of them, entire streets reduced in a matter of hours to foundations and chimneys. Some of it was business, close to 60 of them, shops and storefronts along roads that had carried tourist traffic for decades. Some of it was forest, more than 17,000 acres. Blackened from the valley floor toward ridgelines, the tramway had been carrying sightseers across a year earlier almost to the week. By the official count, it stands as the deadliest wildfire in Tennessee's recorded history. The financial accounting took longer to settle than the fire had taken to burn. Insurance claims from the event would eventually approach $1 billion, filed against homes, cabins, hotels, and small businesses across Sevier County. Officials placed direct damages above $500 million, a figure that did not include what the tourism economy itself lost in the months the valley spent explaining that it was still standing. Gatlinburg's own tax receipts fell 36% in December of 2016 against the same month a year earlier. A single month's numbers, but a fair proxy for how quickly a tourist economy can stall when the footage leaving town is about smoke rather than mountains. The downtown core itself, the parkway with its taffy shops and its Space Needle and its glass-fronted aquarium, had largely escaped the flames outright. That distinction meant less to a traveler watching the news 3 states away than it did to anyone standing on the sidewalk. And over the months that followed, the town spent well over $1 million just making that argument to the rest of the country. Convincing the country was the first bill. It was not the largest one still coming due. Chapter 8. What Remains? The larger bill was not a single invoice. It was paid slowly, in a currency the county did not have enough of: skilled hands. Sevier County and the city eventually issued more than 500 rebuilding permits for homes, cabins, and storefronts alike. But a permit is only paper until somebody frames the wall behind it. Carpenters were scarce. Electricians scarcer still. Licensed contractors almost impossible to find, in a labor market already stretched thin by a decade of cabin construction before the fire ever started. Insurance checks cleared within months. A crew capable of using them could not be conjured at the same speed. The rebuild did not fail. It simply took longer than the fire had. The clearest answer to that wait arrived on May 17, 2019, above the ski park the town had spent decades building on the mountain behind it. The Gatlinburg Sky Bridge opened that day. 680 feet of pedestrian suspension bridge hung 500 feet above the valley floor, with glass panels set into its highest point, so a visitor could look straight down through the deck at the drop below. It was built explicitly as a symbol of recovery, the kind of structure a town commissions when it wants an anniversary to read as a ribbon cutting rather than a memorial. Within months of opening, it was the longest pedestrian suspension bridge in North America. Nothing built since the fire has done more work convincing visitors that 2016 was safely in the past. Some of what the valley lost was already gone before the fire ever reached it. Andy Huff's Mountain View Hotel, the valley's first real hotel, had closed in 1993 and been demolished soon after. A parking lot has occupied the ground ever since. The rest of the original tourist economy fared no better with time. Gone, the shop where Wiley Oakley sold what he carved once he stopped guiding. The looms that carried the settlement school's income are gone too, folded into Arrowmont decades ago. So are the two original slopes the ski club cut into the hardwood in 1962, absorbed so completely into Ober-Gatlinburg that almost nobody crossing the new bridge could point to where they ran. Almost none of the businesses that built the valley's first tourist economy survive in the form their founders gave them. What survives is the appetite they discovered. The hillsides that once supplied Huff's sawmills now hold something else entirely. More than 6,000 active short-term rental listings, cabins built purely for weekend guests against fewer than 3,600 year-round residents. The town's own Tourism Development Authority reported operating revenue near $16 million in a single recent year, raised specifically to keep the marketing engine running. The parkway, laid out for a mountain village that once measured its traffic in wagon axles, now carries the weekend volume of a mid-sized city on 2 lanes that were never widened to match it. A drive that takes 10 minutes on a quiet Tuesday morning can take an hour on a Saturday afternoon in October, and the parking lots downtown routinely fill before noon. The town, underneath all of it, remains what it has always been, a doorway sized for a village. Its permanent population still sits under 4,000. A single crowded weekend brings through more visitors than that, several times over. The valley did not get bigger, it got busier. Fog still settles over Newfound Gap most mornings, the way it has since before the road existed, thick enough by 7 that the ridge disappears above the tree line and reappears an hour later looking exactly as it did before. It moves low and slow across ground that once held farms, close to 6,000 people's worth of them, bought out at $25 an acre in the years before the park had a name. No fence line survives up there now to mark where one family's corn ended and the next one's began. The timber took all of it back within a generation. Every car crossing the gap this morning is heading down into the same valley those farms used to feed, carrying people who come only to look at the mountains, never to live on them. The fog burns off by mid-morning. The valley keeps filling anyway.